I have a funny anecdote about Kamala Harris, actually, because Leisa Schaim, my partner Lisa, noticed way back in like late 2018, there was this period where Lisa discovered that we had a birth time for Kamala Harris, and she just sort of like ran the Zodiacal releasing periods one day. And then there was this period in 2018 where she would not stop talking about how notable and eminent it seemed like Kamala Harris's chart became during the 2020 election. And almost sort of jokingly, but she was just kept going on and on about this. And I think even like we may have had to institute a no prognosticating in the shower rule at one point when she was like making predictions about the presidential election based on like Zodiacal releasing periods. And I don't want to go into all of the details. She did eventually issue a prediction at one point, or not a prediction, but a little tweet, because both of us were trying to stay out of politics. So there was like much deliberation about whether to say anything at all. But in January of 2019, she issued a tweet outlining a little bit of what she had noticed about Kamala's chart becoming more prominent in 2020. And the main thing that Lisa was noticing was that she's been in this 30-year buildup period that eventually culminates when she moves into a 12-year peak period using Zodiac releasing from the Lot of Spirit, starting in December of 2020, which is in that weird sort of in-between period just before the inauguration takes place in January. So it's going to become one of those questions in terms of Zodiac releasing, where does the peak period starting at that time begin because it indicates somebody getting into office and reaching the highest political appointment during their lifetime, or does it indicate that she's becoming more prominent, but perhaps even if she doesn't win this election, it sets her up to want to run again, let's say for the presidency in 2024. It could go either way. So you'd have to take in a lot of other factors into account in order to answer that question. Zodiac releasing. So this is one where we have to give you props because, like I've talked about a few times in the forecast in the past, I think we talked about it in August, maybe, or the August forecast, or maybe it was the September forecast when Harris was officially given the VP nod by Biden and became his running mate in the presidential election. I told this funny story about how there was this period in late 2018 where you just kept talking about...
And you were kind of playing that up.
Yeah, I was playing that as a joke. I was supposed to make a joke about how I couldn't get you to shut up about how eminent Harris's chart looked like it would become around the time of the 2020 presidential election when you were looking at her Zodiac releasing periods. Because it fit one of the classical indicators that came up in different charts, like George Bush's chart, for example, when he became president in 2000 and 2004, of going into a major level 1 peak period that was angular from fortune. And you had discovered at some point in like the second half of 2018 that Harris would go into a peak period that would start in December of 2020. So right after the presidential election, and you thought that this meant that she could potentially win somehow, because this was before she launched her presidential campaign, but she was widely anticipated to, and she did in fact launch it not too long after that. And we were both trying to stay out of political astrology, but after much deliberation, you did put a tweet out sort of saying some of what you thought about that very, not super cryptically, but pretty clearly in early January of 2019.
Yeah. After looking at it in 2018. And I was actually very careful about that because I don't actually really want to fully get myself into that. And I didn't want to be the target of anyone who disagreed with that or anything like that. But at the same time, it was so striking that I wanted to like make a public note of it. And, in case things came back later. Which they have. So I was looking in late 2018 at this, and it was two things. It was the fact, maybe three things. It was the fact that she was moving into a major peak period on level 1, which is the biggest picture peak, level you can have in Zodiacal releasing from Spirit, which is about career and general life direction. And she had already done so much in this very long preparatory period that was supposed to be leading up to the peak period. She had already done so many kind of prominent things. And the peak period is about active and important. And so it's like, what's more active than being a U.S. senator? Like, how many steps up can you go from there? And so I figured either, running for president, VP, or cabinet. Those were my guesses. The other major thing I was looking at there was that it's angular from her benefic of sect. Venus in a night chart tends to be the most positive placement. wherever it's placed in ruling. And so when that gets tied into being angular from the lot of fortune, it means when you go into your peak period, it's also more positive for you. So it was both of those things. And I was like, what's more prominent and more positive than what she's been doing already? And then I also tracked back through a lot of her chronology with the preparatory period, and it lined up like perfectly with all of her career moves, even in one where it should have been actually more challenging because it tied in Mars and Saturn in her prep period.
So here's her birth chart, and since it is just talking about the general periods, the level 1 periods, that's something where we could actually talk through really quickly how that works. So she, interestingly, like Trump, was actually born at a full moon. So both Trump and Kamala Harris were born at a full moon. Hers was not an eclipse because it's not on the nodal axis, but we can see the moon and the sun are exactly opposite to each other, from sun at 27 Libra to moon at 27 Aries. So when the sun and moon are exactly opposite each other, both the lot of fortune and the lot of spirit will both be conjunct the descendant. And that's where they are in this chart. They're both at 24 degrees of Sagittarius, conjunct her descendant. So the way this technique works with zodiac releasing from the lot of spirit is that since spirit and fortune fall in the same sign, you move spirit forward to Capricorn. Capricorn has a 27-year period based on the period of Saturn. So the first chapter of her life lasts for 27 years. And then she goes into a 30-year Aquarius period, the very next sign in zodiacal order, which is, again, a period associated with Saturn for 30 years. And that's the second chapter of her life. And because she has a night chart and Saturn is placed in that sign, it's a little bit more of a difficult period for her. But it's building up to this 12-year Pisces period, which she begins immediately after that. And because that's the sign of Pisces and it's her 10th house and it's square to the sign of her lot of fortune, that is considered to be what we call a peak period that tends to be more active and important. And for people, especially politicians, it can be a period of eminence and doing some of their most important work in some instances. So what you noticed is that she would be moving into that 12-year Pisces peak period, and it would start in December of 2020.
So just about a month before inauguration.
So, and here I found a screenshot of the tweet that you put out in January 2nd of 2019. It says, actually, why don't you read it? Because then it's in your voice.
So I said, I looked at Kamala Harris's chart/career history, and she's definitely rising somehow. Her zodiacal releasing will be excellent soon. At the end of 2020, peak periods on levels 1, 2, and 3. Her whole preparatory level 1 period since 1991 has been steady climb upwards, matches the timing perfectly, in what should have been less prominent, more challenging period compared to 2021 and onward. She's in a completion period now on level 2, switches to peak period level 2 in July for a year. Level 1 peak starts December 25th, 2020. So somehow more prominence and more positive coming up. Look forward to seeing how it plays out.
Yeah. So, and then on the other night on Twitter, she got up and introduced Joe Biden before he sort of announced and accepted and gave his victory speech, basically. And I took a picture of Kamala Harris and posted that above your thing on Twitter.
Yeah.
So what's funny about that, of course, is she then launched her campaign shortly after you made that tweet and then went through the primaries. But one of the things we were both somewhat surprised and disappointed about in terms of the prediction was that she actually dropped out of the presidential race. And at first, it actually looked like that was going to be a failed sort of quasi-prediction. But then later, over the course of this summer, she came back into play and was picked as Joe Biden's running mate and now is the vice president-elect of the United States.
Right. And so, I mean, that is kind of one of those things where it's like, if you see the astrology and what's happening diverging, but there's still more time left in play, it's like, you should trust the astrology as long as you have a good birth time.
Yeah, sometimes. You know? I mean, sometimes you should trust the astrology, definitely.
I mean, that's a whole other digression, really. But I'm just saying this still looked like it had to ramp up somehow. And so we were like, how is that going to happen?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that we still, in our September work session, because this is one of the other things, it was like the eclipse looked really good for Biden, and I thought that was a good thing in his favor. The zodiac releasing looked really good for Kamala Harris, and that was another argument in favor of their ticket. But the only thing that we were nervous and unsure about with the zodiac releasing that was still a problem is that it was opening a 12-year-long peak period for her.
Yeah.
And so one of the dangers and the open questions up until like last week was, does that mean she's going to start becoming eminent now, like starting in December at the very beginning of the peak period? Or is this opening up a whole period of eminence where, because she ran and was the vice presidential candidate this time, would she then, run and win in 2024 or something? That was the secondary scenario that was a possibility that we couldn't rule out.
Yeah, it was not a guarantee, because it's sometimes the case that when people start their new level 1 peak period, things start happening immediately, like pretty quickly, like within that first sub-period. But in other cases, it's more like you're in that milieu now, and now you have the chance to become more prominent, and that still can play out over some time. So it wasn't a guarantee.
And there's also different like levels of prominence, because there's like, you can start it and become prominent, but then you could hit the L2 peak. There can be one or two of those, which she actually will hit in a few
later.
years and could become more prominent during those times.
Right, exactly.